Okay, good evening, Mayor and Councilors. Normally, our Comptroller Rachel Jacobs would be doing this and be prepared with all sorts of great details. She is in Albany right now at a government finance officers meeting and training session. So as you know, this is a multi-month process that we undertake starting in January of every year. And we go through, we look at where we stand with the current year's budget, previous year's budgets going back typically 3 to 5 years. Each of the department heads is presented with their current budget and previous budgets as a starting point for their consideration. They get back to us with their thoughts and ideas related to their operating budget. Most of the personnel-related expenses are handled by the Comptroller's office because of the how much detail and how technical that is. So that typically happens from the Comptroller's office with a few exceptions. And then over time, they feed that stuff back to me and the Comptroller, and then we sit down with each of the department heads, go over their budgets. We typically will trim a few things here and there. There may actually, on occasion, be an addition here and there. And then we put together, or the Comptroller typically will put together on my behalf, the budget that you see here. Again, this is a preliminary budget. So it's here to give you an idea of where we initially stand. There's still, room for movement. There are several things I'll mention at the end that are still things that are in flux. Things like the New York State budget, right? So the New York State budget has an impact on our budget. So until that's passed and we know how some of that state funding goes, we can't be certain. Other things that are somewhat up in the air right now, we have a good idea of what our total assessed value in the city is, but currently the Board of Assessment Review is still conducting reviews with citizens and property owners for that. And when the final roll comes out, that will have an impact on the actual tax rate for us. So this is very, it's a ballpark. It's pretty close, but there's still room for things. Other things that will happen is between now and the end of this fiscal year, we'll do things with our department heads. If they've requested a particular piece of equipment, maybe in next year's budget, but we find out that they are very underspent this year, we may get ahead of things. That helps us close the gap, things like that. So as we move along here, I'll try to zip through this. It's not very long, and it's a pretty high-level view. This year, this particular budget proposal is in at $43,949,604. Again, in this preliminary discussion. That is about a 7.7% increase over the 2022 revised budget, or in terms of dollars and cents, about $3.1 million. The current gap that we've got, in the funding gap, the difference between the revenues we project coming in and the expenditures going out, is about $3.3 or $3.4 million. There's a variety of ways we can tackle that. We have a healthy fund balance right at the moment. That's around $5 million, which is on the high end of what we're allowed to have in fund balance. We have had Arpa funds come in that are able to be utilized for this purpose.
Mr. Dygert, would you
yes.
just, for everyone listening home, would you just explain what the ARPA is again?
Okay, so when we received the federal funds to the tune of approximately $22 million from the federal government for COVID relief, and that could be utilized for operations, it could be used for revenue replacement, it could be utilized for business assistance. Those are all things that this council has voted on, and that $22 million, of which we have received the first tranche, the first appropriation last May of approximately $11 million. Those funds have all been earmarked or allocated for different programs, some of it being our operation, some of it being for the assistance to not-for-profit, community needs, and business needs in the community. And in May, we're in line for another $11 million, which, again, there have been discussions here as far as how those funds will be allocated. So along the way, when we look at this compared to, I know there was a lot of discussion about the new revale of property tax, of properties in the city. When we combine those things, we actually look at a total tax rate decrease, a rate decrease of 14.9%. I'll get into some more details about that here shortly. It is in compliance with the New York State tax cap, which is not as simple as a lot of folks imagine, that, you know, the 2% tax cap, once all the math is done, it's a fairly involved formula. Once all the math is done, it's not exactly 2%, but that's what it's labeled. This proposal is within that state tax cap, and it's in general compliance with the city's 5-year plan. So just to kind of, again, paint a broad picture of things. And some of it can get kind of confusing, but pension costs typically are brought up as a driver of the budget and things like that. This year, across the state, pension costs, the percentage of pension cost as a factor went down across New York State. But for us, the police and fire retirement system saw a slight increase, and that's because of the workforce and where they are in their salary ranges and things like that. But the actual percentage of their salaries that is allocated to the retirement system, that number that the calculation's based on actually went down. The same thing happened in the ERS system, or the employees retirement system for New York State, but because of the employee makeup and where folks are along the lines, and a variety of things, what tier they're in the pension system, how much their salary is, things like that, we actually see an actual 26% decrease in the city's contribution to the employees retirement system in this upcoming budget. Our workers' compensation costs have gone down, and that has a lot to do with our employees and our supervisors and our department heads being diligent about making sure we've got workers employing safe practices, and us making sure we've got good equipment to make sure that our employees aren't getting hurt. So our workers' compensation experience rating was very good, and we are actually seeing a reduction in workers' compensation costs to the tune of over $43,000. And our health insurance costs, the actual impact of health insurance for the coming year is projected to be $171,000, or a 2.2% increase. That's a pretty important number, because if we actually look at the cost of health insurance on its face, there was a 10% increase in the insurance rate. So this has a lot, again, to do with what's happening locally as far as experience and what plans our employees are choosing and things like that. So even though within the industry there's been that bigger jump, we've been able to keep that increase under control here. Again, thanks a lot to our employees for making good decisions that translate into some overall savings for us. So on the revenue side of things, the city property tax rate, again, in this preliminary phase, and this is as we talk over the next several weeks prior to your vote on this budget, that may fluctuate a little bit. But right now in this preliminary presentation, we're looking at a 14.9% decrease in the tax rate. There is a slight increase in tax collections, up 2.28%, which in dollars and cents equates to about $285,000. Again, that's within the property tax cap. For the purposes of creating this budget, And this is another area that we can actually have, we could have some discussion. The comptroller and I, as we had discussions, this budget was created around a 6.3% increase over the 2021 actual collections for sales tax, which, as you can see on the slide, equates to about $650,000. What we are actually seeing over the last several months is about a 20% increase in sales tax collections over 2021. So there's some significant room here. We don't want to get too aggressive with it, but there is some room to actually reasonably expect that we will collect more in sales tax than what we've projected here. Pilots, again, this is just talking about the revenue side of pilots, and with the way different pilots have matured over the last 12 months, we're anticipating an increase of $30,000 in revenue from pilots. One of the other revenue sources is the SAFER grant that the fire department received. That's a 3-year grant to increase staffing in the fire department. Federal program, it pays for all costs associated with those personnel, and the value of that in year one, this year that we're getting into, is $351,000. So that's included in the revenue projections for this. This is probably the most important slide, or the one most people want to see. Up top in the chart, it basically compares what our general city tax rate was in this current year for 21-22, and the anticipated approximate tax rate for next fiscal year, being 22-23. And if we look at that, the general and the CIP combined for the total city tax rate, we would go from a $12.55 a thousand tax rate down to $10.68 a thousand. Again, a decrease of about 14.89%. So what we typically do is we make that comparison against a typical average home in the city. In years past, a typical single-family home in the city was really, really close to about $100,000. It made the math really simple. With the revaluation and what we're seeing in the housing market, currently the average value for a single-family home in the city of Auburn is $120,765. So based on that and applying the tax rate from this current year, that single-family home would have estimated taxes in this current year of $15,000 roughly, and we're projecting that in next year's budget, that would actually be down to around $1,300, or an actual savings of a home of that value or below, a decrease of approximately $225,000. This is just a year-to-year comparison from our current year, 2022, to next year, 2023, and the recommended budget and where those things are. General fund is what we typically spend a lot of time talking about. Mike Talbot will be up later to talk about specifically solid waste, refuse, and transfer station, and how those things all work together. And again, you're aware we're going to have another discussion in the future about the trash collection fee and how that works into things. But so there's some changes there. The power utility fund is up about 14%. The water fund proposed is about a 7% increase. That includes the what you just voted on with the rate increase, and the sewer fund is actually down about 2%. So Seth will be up later to talk about these things in more depth, but the power utility fund has a draft gap of about $577,000. Approximately $300,000 of that is debt service for the cogen facility, which, just as a matter of note, still has an outstanding balance of about $4.3 million. So.
Could you repeat that number? I'm sorry for the code, could you repeat that number?
4.3 million.
Wow, okay, thank you.
The sewer fund is balanced without the use of fund balance, and the water fund has a small draft budget gap of approximately $105,000, which fund balance will cover that. Solid waste fund, again, Mike will get into more detail about this, but it has the solid waste fund in total has a draft gap of about $1.18 million. That's why we're going to have a discussion with you about collection rates and what needs to happen to make sure that this fund stays healthy and appropriate to cover the costs. The landfill account has a draft gap of about $202,000. That account covers things like processing the leachate, which is going to be an ongoing cost. That's about $110,000 a year. And it also includes the annual DEC testing and reporting, which are going to be legacy costs for operating a landfill. Refuse collection, draft gap of about $477,000, and the transfer station with a gap of around $506,000. Much of that is actually the debt service on the facility itself. And again, Mike will dive into some other details further. So again, I mentioned in the beginning that we typically will go through and have discussions with the department heads, and we try to remove things that we can. And there are times when some of those items can't be removed. They're vital to what goes on, or in some cases we find alternative means to fund or finance some of those things. So along the way, for instance, like demolitions that are typically in the codes budget and typically fall victim to the chopping block as we go through the budget process. They were removed again this year, but if you recall, you as council approved the allocation of some of the Arpa funding for those types of projects. So we're able to remove them out of our regular budget, and they're in the background getting covered with that funding. Just a couple things that, and again, as we go through individual budgets for departments that will get covered, and some things that have been discussed in the past, but this budget proposal includes a pretty close estimate of what we feel will be the impact of the 3 current collective bargaining agreements that we are in negotiations with, and all of the other collective bargaining agreements which have annual increases and things like that in them. So this budget includes all of those assumptions. It also includes the position of a grant assistant, which we've talked about here, and that would be somebody that will help administer all these grants, because what we're seeing, especially since these Arpa funds have come out, a lot of the funds coming from the federal government, state government, they're coming in the form of grants, and in order for us to maximize our yield on those grants, we're going to need people to manage them. So that is one position. I mentioned the firefighters. Again, the council approved the acceptance of a SAFER award for firefighters, which will increase the number of firefighters available, which should decrease the amount of overtime. And again, that's fully funded from the federal government for 3 years with no copay from the city. The terms of that have changed over the years. What we've also done, and Mike again will talk more about this, but we've added into this budget two full-time laborers for public works. What we've seen in one of the continued sources of complaints tends to be condition of parks, playgrounds, green spaces, things like that. We continue to spend a lot of money improving parks and green spaces and things like that, but along with that, we've got to have the capacity to maintain those areas, or it's just wasted money. There's also a full-time police officer position included in this with the addition of police body-worn cameras. It's heavy on administration. Somebody has to be able to review all of that information, collect it, gather it, store it, and that has to be someone who is a uniformed officer because of the type of material that's there. So that's proposed in here as well. Things that this obviously doesn't include is additions, deletions, and things like that that you all would present to us in the future. It does not include, as I mentioned earlier, some sort of consideration for increased security at City Hall. And I mentioned that there are typically reductions in the expense side of this as we move along over the next few weeks, as we fund things in different ways, as we get closer to knowing where we're going to land with this current year's budget. Things that we're waiting on confirmation of the New York State budget and what our allocations will be there. We're have not applied any of the FEMA reimbursements here. So there's a variety of FEMA reimbursements that we have outstanding. We've got several applications into FEMA for reimbursements related to our COVID response that have not been paid out yet and are still in process. Those things likely, based on the pace that they're moving at, would be revenues that come in next year, so they could be applied to this. We also have some revenues that the municipal utilities have been working on, or FEMA reimbursements related to Tropical Storm Fred. So those things, depending on when they come in, may be applied here. You already mentioned sales tax is tracking around 20% or better compared to last year, and the final assessment rolls when that happens. So there's still some wiggle room in this. Again, it's an opportunity to give you an idea of basically where we're at. Any questions? I'll do my best. I'm not a comptroller, but I'll do my best if you've got it.
You can dance pretty good if you have to, right?
Okay. All right. Thank you.